He went to the mountains to forget. But his dog found an abandoned black hearse. Inside was an empty coffin and the stash of a billionaire who died without heirs, and the footsteps of those who wanted to hide the truth. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold stone down from the ridge long before Daniel Rowan reached it. He walked with a steady, measured pace, the way years of training had carved into his very bones. But there was no urgency in his steps. He had come here to slow down, not to rush. The mountains rose around him like quiet giants, their slopes wrapped in the brittle silence of early autumn. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that made a man breathe deeper without thinking. Above him, clouds drifted lazily across a pale sky, as if the world itself had grown tired and decided to rest. His German shepherd, Raina, padded beside him, her ears swiveling toward the faintest rustle in the underbrush, her gait light and silent, her tail low but relaxed. She was his shadow, his anchor, and in these places, far from human noise, she seemed to shed the tension she carried just as he tried to shed his own. Daniel had started this solitary hike 3 days ago, hoping to break the loop of sleepless nights and heavy mornings that had followed him ever since he left the service. The quiet didn't cure anything, but at least it didn't worsen it. Up here, there were no sudden shouts, no metallic clangs, no narrow hallways or alarms, only wind and trees. Only his thoughts, which sometimes felt like a burden heavier than the pack on his shoulders, but at least they were his. He could sift through them at his own pace, slow and patient, letting the mountains blunt their sharp edges. He stopped by an outcropping of rocks and drew in a breath that tasted of damp moss and distant rain. Raina paused beside him and lifted her snout, inhaling carefully. Her eyes, dark and alert, flicked toward the horizon, then back to him. He rested a hand on her head, feeling the warmth beneath her fur. The dog leaned into the touch ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement that the world might be unpredictable. But they were together. That alone was enough to keep moving. By midday, the sky began to shift. Thin wisps of gray gathered over the mountaintops, like scouts announcing a coming force. The temperature dropped just enough for Daniel to feel it along the back of his neck. The trail, narrow and uneven, wound down through dense clusters of fir trees, whose branches shuddered in the growing breeze. Leaves skittered across the ground like startled insects. Raina grew more attentive, her steps tighter, her head held higher. She sensed change even faster than he did. The map he carried barely marked this section. It was more suggestion than instruction. The trail had been unused for years, maybe decades, and though he appreciated the solitude, he could feel the weather turning. A storm up here could blanket the world in fog and water, erasing paths and landmarks. Daniel scanned the area for any sign of shelter. A rock shelf, a break in the trees, anything that might shield them if the sky opened. When he didn't find one, he let instinct lead him. Sometimes instinct, the old, well-trained kind, worked better than any printed guide. He noticed a thin side path veering off to the left, half swallowed by shrubs and creeping vines. It wasn't on his map, which only made it more interesting. Raina, however, reacted before he took a step toward it. Her ears snapped forward, her body coiled, not in fear, but in recognition of a scent, a presence, something that pulled her attention fully in that direction. Daniel trusted that intuition more than he trusted most people. He gave a short whistle. The dog moved ahead and he followed. The side path twisted between boulders and brambles until the trees opened suddenly into a narrow corridor of fading dirt and gravel. It was a road, or had once been one, a forgotten rural track, now choked with weeds and cracked by roots. The forest had reclaimed it piece by piece, but the shape was unmistakable. parallel grooves from long-gone tires, a flattened center, the faintest trace of where human travel once carved into the earth. Raina stood still, staring down the road, her tail held straight, her posture tense. Something about the air felt different here, as if the silence had thickened. Daniel stepped forward, his boots sinking into patches of soft earth. Grass brushed against his legs. The road curved slightly to the right, its end hidden by an overgrowth of tangled vines. The storm clouds overhead gathered faster now, the wind picking up, rattling branches like dry bones, shaking in a hollow trunk. He listened, sensing nothing but the wind, until Raina let out a low, uneasy growl. Her nose guided her toward a shape half hidden behind a curtain of foliage. Daniel followed, pushing aside the branches, and what he saw made him pause mid-step. There, sunken in tall grass and rust, sat a black hearse. It looked like a corpse left out in the open for nature to devour. The paint, once glossy, had peeled away in wide flakes, exposing the metal beneath, now eaten through by rust. The tires were deflated and cracked, the rubber long since surrendered to time. Moss clung to the edges of the windows, like the fingers of something trying to pull the car downward. A shattered headlight dangled crookedly, as if the vehicle had one dim, lifeless eye. Grass grew through a jagged hole in the floor panel. The whole thing gave off an air of abandonment so complete that Daniel couldn't imagine anyone touching it in decades. And yet Raina was fixated on it, not with curiosity but with a deep, troubled certainty. She stepped closer, sniffing the air with increasing urgency. That alone was wrong. The hearse should have smelled of mold, old upholstery, stale air, rust, wet soil. But Raina was catching something else. Daniel approached cautiously. His instincts whispered that nothing about this scene matched itself. A hearse abandoned on a long-forgotten road was bizarre enough. But there was more here, something that set his nerves humming faintly, like an electric current waiting just under the skin. He reached for the door handle. The metal was cold, even through his glove, and as he pulled, the hinges resisted. The door opened only after a long, grating screech that cut through the air like a wounded animal's cry. Daniel stepped back slightly, expecting dust, debris, maybe the smell of rot. But inside, everything looked freshly cleaned. The contrast was jarring. The interior was almost unnaturally pristine. The seat cushions weren't torn, the walls weren't stained, and the metal rails gleamed faintly, as if wiped down recently. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no mildew clinging to the corners. It felt wrong, deeply wrong, like someone had polished the inside of a ruin and walked away without touching the outside at all. Then his gaze fell on the coffin. It lay secured with thick transport straps, the kind used when moving heavy cargo over rough ground. The coffin itself was new modern, expensive, lacquered to a soft sheen that reflected what little daylight crept into the cabin. It didn't belong in a vehicle that looked ready to collapse from rust. The straps holding it down were tightened with professional precision. Someone had taken care to ensure it wouldn't shift an inch during transit. Daniel felt a cold, deliberate calculation behind every detail. He approached the coffin slowly. Raina stayed close, her throat vibrating with another low growl, both warning and unease. Daniel rested his hand on the lid. The wood was cool, smooth, untouched by weather or decay. He lifted it carefully. The coffin was empty, yet the smell rising from its interior told another story. One of old metal, velvet, and something faintly sweet, like aged wood and sealed spaces. A scent of something recently transported. Near the corner of the coffin, he noticed a small chip in the lacquer. From that chip, lodged in the seam, were several tiny gold coins. Their surface was worn with age, the edges roughened by time. Raina began sniffing around the inner wall of the hearse, then abruptly scratched at a panel with sudden insistence. Daniel bent down. The panel looked ordinary, but something about the grain of the wood was inconsistent. He pried it carefully with the tip of his knife. It loosened, then came free entirely. Behind it lay a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment was a collection so strange and out of place that he felt an involuntary tightening in his chest. Dozens of antique jewels, brooches with cracked gemstones, rings heavy with ornate filigree, seals bearing crests he didn't recognize, pocket watches with engraving in faded cursive. Alongside them were folded documents, deeds, property titles, old certificates, all marked with names from another era. And among these stacks of wealth lay a large envelope sealed with the embossed name of a billionaire recluse, whose death had made national news only a week earlier. They had said he died without heirs, without possessions, without anything worth fighting for. That had clearly been a lie. Daniel stared at the envelope. Something was deeply, dangerously wrong. He pulled out his phone and took several photos, documenting everything quickly but carefully, his instincts screaming that evidence might soon become a matter of survival. As he moved to step back from the vehicle, he froze. On the rusted exterior, smeared across the dusty doorframe, was a fresh handprint. Not old, not weathered, not forgotten. Fresh, the kind of print left by someone who had touched the metal only hours ago. Raina's growl deepened, turning into a sharp, alert bark. Her body angled toward the trees, tense and rigid. Daniel followed her gaze. Among the rhythmic flutter of branches swaying in the rising wind, he heard it. Faint footsteps, deliberate, too heavy to be an animal, too close to be chance. His pulse quickened, though his hands remained steady. Someone else was here. Someone who knew about the hearse, someone who cared enough to return. And whoever they were, they would not want a witness walking away with this knowledge. The woods felt suddenly narrower, the air thinner, the coming storm heavier. Daniel stepped back from the hearse and lowered himself into a crouch, signaling Raina silently. The dog moved with him, muscles taut, ears forward, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows between the pines. The footsteps grew clearer, closer. Daniel took one slow breath, then another. His mind aligned itself the way it always had in danger, calmly, methodically. Whatever was about to unfold, he would face it. Not alone. Not unprepared. Behind him, the hearse sat in its grave of rust and weeds, hiding secrets worth killing for. Ahead of him, the forest swallowed the sound of someone approaching, and the storm, unhurried but inevitable, continued to gather above the mountains. The footsteps that drifted toward Daniel through the darkening forest were soft enough to be mistaken for shifting leaves, yet deliberate enough to erase any hope they belonged to an animal. Raina pressed close to his leg, her body low and rigid, her gaze fixed on the thicket ahead. The air around them thickened, as though the coming storm had seeped into the trees, weighing down each breath. Daniel stayed crouched beside the hearse, every sense sharpened. The world felt suspended, holding its breath with him. He waited until the steps paused. The quiet that followed was too complete, the kind that signaled someone listening, scanning the area with the same caution he used himself. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were searching. Raina's ears twitched sharply to the right. Daniel turned his head just enough to follow her line of attention. A faint metallic click, almost swallowed by the wind, confirmed what he suspected. Someone was checking equipment, maybe a weapon. The presence of firearms wouldn't have surprised him. What unsettled him was the calm confidence in their approach. These weren't panicked trespassers stumbling upon their abandoned cargo. These were people accustomed to operating in silence. Daniel whispered a command under his breath. Raina shifted behind him, keeping low, perfectly aligned with his movements. Without rising, he began to retreat from the hearse, one slow step at a time, careful to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The forest grew dimmer as the clouds gathered overhead, shadows knitting themselves into a nearly seamless curtain. He used them the way he once used ruins and broken walls. Cover, concealment, advantage. The voices came next, muted but unmistakably human. Said it would be here, one whispered, breath uneven from a hurried climb. If someone found it. No one's out here, another interrupted, flatter and calmer. You're spooking yourself. Check the straps first. If they're loose, someone opened it. Daniel felt a chill spread slowly across his shoulders. They were close enough that he could hear the scrape of shoes against rocks, the swish of branches brushed aside. Raina moved a few inches closer, trembling, not in fear, but in controlled readiness, waiting for his next signal. Carefully, Daniel angled himself farther from the road, leading Raina into the thicker undergrowth. They slipped between a cluster of boulders and the trunk of a fallen pine. The position gave them cover and a vantage point overlooking the hearse without exposing their silhouettes. Daniel sank down behind the rocks, just high enough to observe what unfolded. 3 figures emerged from the trees. The first wore a funeral service uniform, the kind Daniel recognized from the company logo stitched onto the chest. He looked young, anxious, constantly glancing over his shoulder. The second was a middle-aged man with a trimmed beard and the stiff posture of someone who had spent years giving orders. The third older, leaner, with slicked back hair, moved with the smooth certainty of someone who didn't need to check his surroundings to know he held authority. His suit, though wrinkled by the difficult terrain, was unmistakably expensive. The older man approached the hearse and laid a hand on the door, his fingers pausing a moment on the same metal where Daniel had seen the fresh handprint. He crouched, studying the ground, then rose as if confirming a private suspicion. It was opened, he murmured. Someone was here. The younger man shifted nervously. You think they saw everything? Everything they needed to, the older man said. His voice was quiet, even thoughtful, but thick with consequence. Which means we have a problem. Daniel stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Raina did the same, her gaze locked on the men, her jaw tight. The weight of the situation settled fully into Daniel's mind. These weren't amateur thieves who stumbled on wealth and panicked. They were coordinated, purposeful, and deeply invested in keeping their operation hidden. The man in the funeral uniform stepped back from the hearse. But what about the body? Or, well, what should have been inside? This wasn't part of the plan. There was no body, the middle-aged man snapped. It was never meant to carry one. Our job was simple. Move the cargo. Everything after that is your employer's business. He nodded toward the older man. The older man crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he studied the ground around the hearse. The question is not what happened to the body. The question is, who found our vehicle? Someone was close enough to leave footprints, he said. He traced a path with his eyes along the disturbed soil and crushed grass. And close enough to discover the compartment. The young one swallowed hard. Should we go after them? The older man finally straightened, his face calm and expressionless. Of course we go after them. Whoever they are, they now hold evidence that can't fall into the wrong hands. Daniel felt Raina's muscles tightening. He eased a hand silently onto her back, steadying her, reminding both of them to remain still. But he knew they couldn't stay here long. The men would circle the area, widen their search, and eventually notice the subtle signs of his presence. The storm, gathering momentum overhead, would only help them hear anything that shouldn't be there. One of the men opened the hearse door fully. The interior's unnatural cleanliness made him flinch. This is fresh. Someone scrubbed it before we left, but it doesn't match the outside. Anyone seeing this would immediately know. That is why it must be retrieved, the older man interrupted, his patience wearing thin. The vehicle was never supposed to be left behind, if its engine hadn't failed. He exhaled a long, slow breath, as if steadying himself. We move to the site. The faster we secure it, the less exposure we risk. Daniel strained to hear the rest. The man in the funeral uniform leaned closer. What about the bunker? If someone's already snooping around here, doesn't that put the whole thing at risk? You let me worry about the bunker, the older man said, his tone dropping to something far more dangerous. Your job is simple. We locate the witness. We silence the witness. Then we finish what we started. The younger man nodded, but Daniel could see the hesitation in his stiff posture, in the slight quiver of his hands. The anxiety in his face suggested he hadn't signed up for anything involving witnesses, let alone silencing them. The thought flickered briefly. Fear might drive him to make noise or mistakes, but Daniel dismissed it. People like him, caught between fear and obedience, often did exactly what they were told. The older man stepped back from the hearse and closed the door with a surprisingly gentle push. Spread out. Look for footprints, broken branches, any sign that the intruder stayed nearby. They couldn't have gone far. Not on foot. Reina tensed at the word intruder, and Daniel knew they had only seconds before the search fanned outward. He leaned closer to her ear and whispered a command. She shifted silently, prepared to move. The men separated, each taking a different direction through the trees. The forest swallowed them one by one, leaving only the rising hum of the storm and the faint crackle of underbrush in their wake. Daniel didn't hesitate. He rose from behind the rocks and slipped deeper into the woods, choosing a path with the most uneven ground to mask their tracks. Reina followed closely, matching the precision of his steps. He angled toward thicker brush, weaving between low-hanging branches and patches of thorny shrubs that would deter casual pursuit. Once they were far enough away to risk sound, Daniel exhaled slowly. The tension that had gripped his spine didn't lessen, but sharpened into focus. These men weren't bluffing. They weren't frightened. They were organized. They had a plan involving the hearse, the coffin, the hidden jewels, and the documents bearing the dead billionaire's name. And whatever lay at the end of their route, the bunker was important enough to kill for. He moved swiftly but carefully, each foot placement deliberate. Reina stayed slightly ahead now, nose close to the ground, sniffing for human scent. Her training made her invaluable. She would detect pursuit long before he did. The forest grew darker as rain began to scatter in thin, cold drops from the heavy sky. Soon, the sparse sprinkle would turn into a full downpour. Daniel welcomed it. Rain was an ally. It softened footprints, blurred scent trails, and masked small sounds that might betray their presence. It also meant the men would have to work twice as hard to find them. As they approached a rise in the terrain, Reina stopped abruptly. She pivoted left, her body angled toward a distant sound. Daniel froze, listening. Faint voices drifted on the wind, more than 2, possibly 4. They were spreading out, covering ground quickly. He needed elevation, a better vantage point. He scaled a narrow incline of rocks, slick with moisture, Reina following just behind him, her paws placing themselves instinctively on the safest footholds. At the top, the forest opened into a long, sloping hill. From there, he could see the men moving through the trees in coordinated arcs, sweeping the area with disciplined precision. The older man was nowhere in sight, which told Daniel one thing: he was already heading toward the bunker. Whatever secrets lay hidden there, they needed to reach it before he did. He crouched, scanning the ground. A faint trail led in the direction opposite the search party. Not a human trail too narrow, too overgrown, but the ground bore impressions he recognized immediately. Someone had passed here recently, carrying weight. The heel marks were deeper on one side, the soil slightly disturbed, as if someone dragged a heavy bag or case. The direction aligned with the faint ridge he saw on the men's map when they discussed the bunker. Reyna sniffed, confirming the scent from the hearse's hidden compartment. Whoever had carried those valuables had moved this way. Daniel knew they had one advantage. He and Reyna were quiet. Their training was not the polished, rehearsed stealth of criminals, but the ingrained survival instinct of people who had lived through ambushes, night operations, and enemy territory. They moved through the mountain like water, adjusting to every obstacle, slipping between cracks in the terrain. Guided by the subtle trail, they pressed onward. The forest thickened, branches crowding overhead, needles whispering against one another. The sky dimmed to a heavy gray, and thunder rolled distantly across the peaks. The air smelled of wet earth and coming rain. As they progressed, Daniel noted signs that the men had used this route before. An old tree trunk bore fresh scrapes, as if something metallic brushed against it. A patch of ground had been cleared recently, the vegetation trampled. A broken piece of strap, similar to the coffin restraints, lay half buried in the soil. Reyna nosed it, then looked up at him with a low whine. They were getting closer. Eventually, the sound of the search party faded behind them. The storm, however, did not. Rain began to fall in earnest, tapping against the leaves, gathering in rivulets along the rocks. The forest floor grew slick underfoot, but Daniel's pace didn't slow. He welcomed the storm's noise. The more the rain fell, the more invisible they became. As evening crept in, the forest darkened until it was almost indistinguishable from night. Reyna nudged him gently, her instincts warning him not to push too far in failing light. He stopped beneath a large fir tree, its branches dense enough to form a temporary shelter. From here, he could hear the faint crackle of a fire a short distance away. The criminals had made camp. Daniel lay low and crawled to the edge of a drop-off, peering down into a shallow basin shielded by rocks and fallen trees. There, illuminated by the flickering firelight, the three men sat huddled, their faces drawn in tight expressions. They were not celebrating or resting. They were talking in terse, clipped tones, the kind used for planning, not for conversation. The older man, now revealed by firelight, held a map, one Daniel recognized from the brief glimpse earlier. It bore the outline of the mountain range and a small, circled X deep in the forest. The bunker. Daniel studied their layout, their equipment, their weapons. Every detail mattered. It told him he wasn't dealing with opportunists, but with a structured operation, maybe even a criminal network. Reyna lay beside him, unmoving, her eyes fixed on the men below. He listened, letting their words sink into him one by one. "If we get there before anyone else, we can seal the entrance," the older man was saying. "There's no reason to delay. The assets inside belong to the highest bidder. The old man was supposed to be dead weeks earlier, but he dragged it out, and people started asking questions." "What if this witness tells the police?" the younger man asked in a trembling voice. "What if the photos get out?" "They won't," the older man replied calmly. "If they took anything, we retrieve it. If they saw anything, we silence them. We have no room for mistakes." Daniel watched long enough to understand he had no choice but to move faster than them, not just for his own safety, but to uncover what was hidden inside the bunker before the truth was buried forever. He backed away from the slope, the firelight disappearing between the trees. Reyna followed, shaking droplets of rain from her coat. The storm intensified, lightning flashing in distant bursts that illuminated the forest in white flickers. Daniel moved toward the ridge the map had pointed to, the ground rising steadily beneath his feet. Every step deepened the sense of inevitability. He didn't know exactly what he would find at the bunker, but he knew this. Whatever lay inside, these men wanted it enough to kill. Thunder cracked directly overhead. Daniel pressed forward through wind and rain, Reyna beside him. The forest narrowed into a tight passage of tall pines, their trunks black against the gloom. The faint outline of a cliffside appeared ahead. And there, carved into the stone, half hidden behind hanging branches and thick vines, he saw it. A heavy metal door, rusted yet intact. The entrance to the bunker. The storm roared behind him. The forest held its breath. Daniel approached the door, his hand finding the cold, corroded metal. Everything that had begun with a rusted hearse and an empty coffin had led him here. And somewhere behind him, the men who wanted him dead were closing in. The storm had settled into a steady, relentless downpour by the time Daniel reached the metal door embedded in the cliffside. Rain pounded the ground with enough force to turn soil into thick sludge, and the wind roared through the trees like a chorus of furious voices. Reyna stood beside him, soaked but alert, her coat plastered to her sides, her breath rising in faint white clouds. The heavy door loomed before them, its surface mottled with rust and streaked by years of water and mineral deposits from the rock above. A faint pattern of corrosion traced its edges, like the scars of old battles it had survived. The lock mechanism was ancient, but intact, a combination of gears and a simple lever system that hadn't moved in years. Daniel placed his hands on the cold metal and braced his feet in the mud. With a steady pull, he tried the handle. It resisted him at first, refusing to yield even an inch. He leaned in, muscles tightening as he applied pressure, using the strength that had never fully left him despite the years of strain. The metal groaned in protest, rust grinding against rust, until slowly, so slowly, it began to shift. A creak echoed through the forest, swallowed almost immediately by the storm. He pulled harder, and the door finally gave way, opening just enough to spill a breath of stale, cold air into the rain-soaked night. Reyna stepped forward to sniff the darkness beyond. Her ears swiveled, her nose twitching as she registered scents buried beneath dust and age. Daniel pushed the door wider, and together they stepped inside. The air felt colder than he expected, carrying the faint smell of mold and copper, as if time had decayed within these walls but had failed to escape. When he switched on his small flashlight, the beam cut through the blackness and revealed a long corridor stretching ahead. The walls were lined with peeling paint, flaking off in long curls that lay scattered on the floor like shed skin. Old pipes ran along the ceiling, some leaking slow, deliberate drops of water that pooled on the concrete. The echo of Reyna's footsteps mingled with Daniel's, each sound amplified by the empty tunnel. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind and rain. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost physical. In this sealed world of forgotten intentions and abandoned plans, even the storm outside seemed distant. Daniel moved slowly down the corridor, sweeping the beam of his flashlight from side to side. The bunker had been designed to withstand disasters, both natural and man-made. Thick concrete, reinforced steel, narrow passages in their prime. These structures were fortresses. Now the place looked more like a tomb. The deeper they went, the more the walls compressed the sound of their movements, swallowing it in an oppressive quiet. Reyna suddenly stopped beside a rusted doorframe leading into a small room. She sniffed the air intently, then looked up at Daniel with a sharp, questioning gaze. He stepped inside and found signs that contradicted the bunker's abandoned state. A cigarette butt rested near the corner, fresh enough that its filter had not yet yellowed. Nearby lay a wrapper from a protein bar, torn recently. Someone had been here not long ago, hours at most. Daniel crouched and touched the floor. Dust patterns were disturbed. Footprints, faint but visible under the flashlight, led out of the room and further into the bunker's depths. They were careful steps, placed by someone who knew how to move quietly, someone who didn't want to disturb more than necessary. He followed the prints with his eyes before rising again. They continued deeper, their pace slow, their senses sharpened. The bunker's corridors continued branching out in unpredictable angles, small chambers, equipment rooms, storage areas. Some doors hung open, revealing nothing but collapsed shelves and rotting wood. Others were sealed shut, their metal warped and immovable. Raina sniffed each threshold before moving on, her instincts guiding them through the maze. After several minutes of weaving through the labyrinthine passages, Daniel spotted a metal cabinet, half open against the far wall of a larger room. The flashlight beam reflected faintly off its surface. Something about the cabinet looked untouched by the decay of the surrounding room, as if it had been preserved or opened recently. Daniel approached cautiously. The door creaked as he pulled it open. Inside, stacked meticulously on shelves, were files in waterproof sleeves, old leather-bound folders, and metal boxes with padlocks. These were no ordinary possessions. This was a treasure trove of paperwork, wills, deeds, detailed inventories of assets, and collections of receipts from decades past. Among them, on the highest shelf, rested a folder embossed with the name of the billionaire whose envelope Daniel had found in the hearse. Inside were handwritten notes, maps, and documents that detailed transfers of wealth, hidden properties, and irregular transactions. It was clear the billionaire had been preparing to move his assets before his death. Preparing to hide them somewhere nobody would ever suspect, Daniel flipped through the papers, his mind connecting pieces of the puzzle. The billionaire hadn't been hiding from the government, as the news had implied. He had been hiding from the men who claimed to be his closest associates, men who now sought the very wealth he had tried to protect. The bunker was meant to house his secrets until he could finalize whatever plan he had almost completed before his sudden death. A faint echo of footsteps rippled through the hallway behind him. Raina's ears snapped toward the corridor, her body stiffening. Daniel shut the cabinet quietly and motioned for her to follow. They slipped back into the shadows, near a rusted metal shelf, as the sound grew louder. His breath stilled as 3 figures entered the room, flashlight beams sweeping across the walls and floor. The older man walked ahead, his posture straight, despite the claustrophobic depths of the bunker. Behind him came the younger funeral worker and the middle-aged man with the hardened stare. Their voices echoed faintly in the cold air. "Spread out," the older man ordered. "We need to confirm no one else reached the core." "There were tracks outside," the middle-aged man muttered. "Someone was close. Maybe already inside." The younger man swallowed audibly. "You think they saw the documents? The jewelry? That's enough evidence to ruin all of us." "That is why we must find them," the older man said calmly, "before they get out." Daniel pressed himself deeper into the shadows as the men passed only a few feet from him. Raina remained perfectly still, not even her breathing audible. The flashlight beam swept across the room but didn't linger on their hiding place. Daniel listened as the men examined the cabinet. A soft curse escaped the older man's lips when he realized it had been opened. "We're not alone," he said, each word clipped with quiet fury. "Find them. Now." The men scattered, moving swiftly down separate corridors. As soon as their footsteps faded, Daniel emerged, knowing time was slipping away. He moved in the opposite direction, following the deeper passageways of the bunker. Raina kept close, her paws barely making a sound. They entered an area less ruined by age. The walls here were reinforced with thicker steel, and old yellowed signs pointed toward a central control room and storage levels. Daniel pushed deeper into this section until he reached a metal door slightly ajar. He nudged it open with the toe of his boot and shined the flashlight inside. A wide room stretched before him, filled with old wooden crates stacked atop each other. Some were labeled with codes, others with locations that matched the properties listed in the billionaire's documents. This was the heart of the Operation Legal Ownership: hidden wealth, private assets all accounted for and stored in secrecy. This bunker had been the old man's insurance against betrayal. Raina wandered forward, sniffing the ground. She paused at a set of footprints leading out the other side of the room. These were different, fresher, shallower, almost hesitant. Daniel followed them through the far door and down a narrow hallway. At its end stood a metal ladder leading to an upper level. He climbed silently, Raina remaining below to keep watch. At the top, he found a panel half open, wires exposed. The control room. From here, the bunker's ventilation, emergency locks, and power systems could be managed. He scanned the area, noticing recent activity. Someone had tampered with the ventilation controls. The wires were loose, the switch flipped. He didn't know why, but something told him it was dangerous to linger. A sound caught his attention. Footsteps. Again, heavier this time, accompanied by hushed voices. One of the men had entered the hallway below. Daniel climbed back down and rejoined Raina. They moved swiftly, every second crucial now. They retraced their steps toward a lower section of the bunker. The air felt colder here, the walls dripping with condensation. The concrete floor sloped downward into a long stretch of darkness. When Daniel shined the flashlight, the beam revealed an old storage chamber lined with metal shelves. Some shelves were empty, others piled with rotting boxes. In the center lay a crate partially broken open. Inside, wrapped in old cloths, were more jewels: rings, necklaces, heirloom brooches, the kind of treasure that spoke of generations of inherited wealth. Raina approached the crate and growled softly, not at the contents, but at a scent near the entrance. Daniel turned sharply and saw movement in the dark. A man stepped forward, the middle-aged one with the hardened stare, his face twisted with recognition and anger when he saw Daniel. "You?" the man hissed, drawing the pistol from his holster. "You should have stayed out of this." Daniel reacted instinctively, ducking to the side as the man fired. The bullet ricocheted off a metal shelf, the sound deafening in the confined space. Raina lunged at the attacker, her teeth flashing briefly in the beam of the flashlight. She caught his arm, forcing the pistol from his grasp. Daniel charged forward, tackling the man into the shelves. Boxes tumbled around them, and the attacker grunted as he hit the floor. Raina held on, her jaws clamped tight. Daniel seized the man's wrist, twisting it until he cried out and dropped the weapon. A swift blow to the jaw sent the attacker sprawling unconscious. Breathing heavily, Daniel retrieved the pistol and checked the hallway for signs of the others. The older man and the younger funeral worker would not be far behind. He signaled to Raina with a hand gesture, and together they moved deeper into the bunker. The storage rooms gave way to narrower passages until Daniel spotted a door marked with faded red letters. It looked like an exit one of the emergency routes that likely led to an external tunnel. But the handle didn't budge when he pulled, locked from the outside. They were trapped between the men hunting them and the maze that had begun to feel like a closing fist. He forced himself to think clearly. They needed leverage, evidence, a way not only to escape, but to expose everything. And he knew exactly where that evidence lay: the documents from the cabinet, the crates of stolen heirlooms, the journals and receipts. If he left the bunker alive with even a fraction of what he'd seen, he could dismantle the entire operation. Behind him, footsteps grew louder. Angry voices echoed through the corridor. Daniel grabbed a discarded rope from the floor, old but sturdy, and moved into a side room. Raina followed, her breathing steady despite the tension. He pulled the unconscious man inside and tied him securely, making sure he couldn't move even if he woke. Then he found a small emergency tunnel on the far side, partially hidden behind fallen beams. It sloped upward, faint light dripping in from above. He guided Reyna into the passage first, then crawled behind her. The tunnel was tight, barely wider than his shoulders, and each movement scraped against the walls. Damp earth filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of rust. As he climbed, the thunder rumbled again outside. He reached the end of the tunnel and spotted a grate. It was old and weak, and with a powerful push, he forced it open. Fresh air washed over him, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. They emerged near the cliffside. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, the storm moving eastward. The sky was dim, but not completely dark. Dawn approached. The forest around them glowed faintly in the muted gray light. Daniel turned back toward the bunker entrance. He could hear distant shouting inside, confusion, anger, realization. It was over. He guided Reyna down the slope and found a spot to call authorities. It took time, but when the officers arrived, they searched the bunker thoroughly. They found the unconscious man tied up in the storage room, the crates of jewels, the documents. Everything Daniel had discovered became part of the investigation. By noon, the entire operation unraveled. The older man was found attempting to flee. The funeral worker surrendered quietly, too shaken to continue running. The truth of the billionaire's death came to light. His life ended not by illness, but by betrayal. The evidence hidden for years became the very thing that condemned the conspirators. Daniel watched the law enforcement vehicles leave the forest, their wheels carving fresh tracks in the soft mud. Reyna sat beside him, leaning against his leg. She was tired, but unharmed, and he ran his hand along her back gently. The world around them seemed calmer now, as though the storm had taken the danger with it. Mist rose from the forest floor, drifting lazily through the trees. The mountains stood quiet and tall, indifferent to the chaos that had just unfolded. Daniel took one last look at the bunker entrance, now guarded by police tape and marked for forensic investigation. The air was cold, but it felt lighter. He and Reyna had survived. They had uncovered the truth. They had walked through darkness and come out the other side. When he finally turned away from the cliff, Reyna followed. Together they walked down the trail, side by side, as the gray morning slowly brightened into day. Subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and share this one with someone who needs to see it.